Welcome to today's webinar. This is a webinar on mobile and digital wallets, and this is part 2 of a series. And today's topic is going to be on secure technologies and approaches. Hi, my name is Randy Vanderhoof, and I'm the director of the U.S. Payments Forum, an affiliated organization under the Secure Technology Alliance organization, and that was formerly known as the Smart Card Alliance. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar has concluded. There will be time at the end of the webinar for questions, so I encourage our listeners to submit their questions using the user dashboard on your screen. I'll return at the end of the presentation to lead the Q&A and suggest that you submit questions while the speaker is presenting so we have time to organize them in advance, and that way we can get to as many of them as we have time left in the hour. So if we can go to our next slide. For those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. Payments Forum, here's a brief overview. The forum is a cross-industry body that's focused on supporting the introduction and implementation of EMV and other new and emerging technologies that protect the security and enhance opportunities for payment transactions within the United States. We cover not only the what, where, and when of payments, but more importantly, the how about how these payment technologies are being implemented. The focus of the organization in the last few years, from it being singularly dedicated to EMV and its migration into the U.S. market, now has a much broader focus on other technologies beyond the card and EMV transaction flow. And our work supporting the continued adoption of EMV continues for late maturing segments of the retail market, such as the petroleum industry, transportation, and hospitality merchants that are going through their own EMV enablement issues. Also, EMV contactless and mobile acceptance, particularly around testing and certification, is very important, as is our issuer considerations for issuing new contactless EMV or dual interface cards and cards that support offline data authentication. Increased attention on education and addressing issues affecting payments that go beyond EMV, like mobile payment and tokenization, authentication, biometrics, future cardholder verification developments, and emerging standards addressing e-commerce channels like 3D Secure, secure remote commerce, and new fraud mitigation tools to combat CardNotPresent fraud are also very active issues that are being discussed within the forum. We can go to the next slide, please. So the U.S. Payments Forum brings together in this open forum of equals across the payments ecosystem, leading companies representing the global payments brands, financial payments issuers, merchants, processors, debit networks, mobile services providers, and other industry suppliers, integrators, associations, governments, and transportation operators. And it's through these organizations that we form collaborative groups to work on projects to develop resources to assist with the U.S. EMV migration and implementation of these other new and emerging payment technologies. And we do this through a series of white papers and educational resources that are developed. Some of them are involved with formulating best practices and commenting on technical recommendations to help resolve issues that might be slowing down the implementation of some of the new specifications and standards that are coming into the market. Our educational focus for our members in the industry comes in the form of webinars, workshops, and forum member meetings and published resources. In addition, we provide communications to the marketplace through our public relations presence and providing our resources that are free and available to the market to consume. And then lastly, one of the most important benefits of being in the U.S. Payments Forum is the opportunity to network with other industry stakeholders, to interact with them on getting perspectives and issues resolved with regard to how payments technology is evolving in the U.S. If you want more information and resources about the U.S. Payments Forum, they're available on the U.S. Payments Forum website, which is listed here above. We can go to the next slide. So this Mobile and Digital Wallet webinar series is a product of two of our working committees, the Mobile and Contactless Payments Group and the Communications and Education Group. These groups have planned a series of 4 educational sessions on mobile and digital wallets as part of a Lunch and Learn webinar series. Today is the second of this series, and we hope you will all be making plans to participate in all 4 of these webinars. If you missed the first webinar in the series, which was on mobile wallet security technologies and approaches, that information, that webinar is available for replay on the site which hosts all of these webinars that you will be receiving a link to after today's webinar is completed. So as you can see, today's webinar is going to be on mobile wallet security technologies and approaches. And then following this, we have another one scheduled for February 6th on strategic considerations for mobile and digital wallets from a merchant's perspective. And then lastly, the 4th webinar will be on February 20th, which will be strategic considerations for financial institutions. So getting these very important stakeholder group perspectives in how mobile and contactless is evolving in the market is something that I think all of the industry would benefit from learning and hearing more about. After today's webinar, there's going to be an optional short 5 to 10 minute online assessment test available to test your comprehension and retention of the material that's been presented today. Those who wish to participate in all 4 webinars and these assessment exams will receive a certificate of completion from the U.S. Payments Forum if they gain a passing grade in all 4 exams. So if we can go to the next slide. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Marianne Crowe is Vice President of Payment Strategies at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. She oversees industry analysis and applied research on digital and mobile retail payments, standards, and security initiatives. And she leads the Mobile Payments Industry Work Group, representing a mobile payment stakeholders focused on eliminating barriers to successful adoption of mobile and digital retail payments in the U.S. And I'm a proud member of that Mobile Payments Work Group organization. She was a payments liaison with the Federal Reserve's Secure Payments Task Force and currently provides support for the Fed's Secure Payments Study. And she's also an active member of the U.S. Payments Forum. So let's advance to the next slide, and I'll turn things over to Marianne.
Okay, thank you, Randy, and hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar this afternoon on mobile wallet security. Kathy, can we go to the next slide for the agenda, please? So I'm going to talk today, just give you an overview of the different wallet models and how security approaches are used in the different models, where there are some similarities and where some of the differences are. And these will relate to the wallets that the other group talked about in the first webinar a couple of weeks ago. This isn't intended to be a technical discussion, but I will talk about some of the underlying components for security tools that support some of the different wallets, just to give you a sense of what they mean. But clearly, if you need more information, there are lots of experts in the industry who can go into more depth on some of these and how they work in detail. But I am going to cover the pay wallets, as we know them, Apple, Google, and Samsung, as well as generally about some of the other digital wallets and QR-based wallets to give you some idea of what security components they use. And we'll also cover them and show a little bit of differences between what's happening at the point of sale and in the digital environment as well. So next slide, please. Okay, so before we start the discussion, we're going to give you a polling question. And basically, just to say, do you think mobile wallet payments are as secure as the chip cards now that we have those? And do you think they're as secure? Do you think that mobile wallets are more secure or less secure? And we'll ask you that now, and then at the end of the session, we will probably have another question for you about this. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer this question, and then we will move to the next slide. But generally speaking, there are a lot of different components in this landscape. So it's not an easy answer, and things are changing as we go. Every day something new comes out. So I'm looking at the results right now, and it looks about not quite half say they are as secure as chip cards, and maybe about almost 50% it looks like said that they're more secure, and then maybe 15%. I don't have percentage lines, but I'm looking at the colors here, saying that they're less secure. So we'll go through this presentation, and we'll see if you have changed your minds at all when we get to the end. So next slide, please, Kathy. Okay, so I'd like to start just by showing you, when I view this current landscape of the different wallet models, I'd like to present it in this kind of a format, so that one of the things that we hear in the past is that the market's very fragmented. There are too many different solutions out there for mobile and digital wallets. We don't know how they work or how they fit together. And so this chart just kind of gives you a sense of how they're somewhat connected. And there are really relatively few wallet platforms and underlying security approaches in the U.S. for mobile and digital wallets, and I think that we try to depict that here. And to some degree, they're connected by the channels in which they work or the security technologies that they deploy. So there's overlap there as well. So if you look at that second layer, you see the security technology solutions that are cutting across different wallet platforms. For example, tokenization or risk-based authentication, which right here is just shown as 3D Secure. So I am going to talk about all of those things in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons why we need to do this and why this is important for everybody is that using mobile wallets, they have lots of benefits and advantages. They also have multiple points of vulnerability, as are detected here. So we're all concerned about payment security based on the effects of large-scale data breaches, the theft of sensitive customer payment data, credentials, passwords, things that can lead to account takeover or identity fraud. And so, now that more payments are being made over the mobile and digital channels, obviously these risks and concerns are increasing as well. So this chart just shows that one of the big barriers to achieving effective security is that there are so many different points of access and vulnerability into a mobile payment wallet, whether it's used in point of sale or CardNotPresent space. And why is that? Well, we see here there are different platforms, different processes, different components, different organizations building and developing those things. We've got the physical device, the mobile device that has to be secured on the phone. The mobile apps have to be secured, and that's not necessarily being done exactly the same way. The consumers themselves play a role in protecting the physical mobile device as well as their apps from theft and loss, and as well as bad code, but they also are a vulnerability in themselves, as we all know. There are different wallet platforms, such as near-field communication or QR code. They have some different risks, and so they have some different security requirements. And then we have different ways of storing the data. You can store it in the phone, you store it in the cloud. It can be in traditional merchant files or card on file with providers or processors. Another key area is authentication of the user when that person is enrolling in a wallet. The authentication methods vary, they're not consistent, and it's another place, a key place where payment credentials can be exposed if it's not strong authentication. And then finally, replacing the real payment account number, or PAN, with a token is considered more secure, but even tokens have to be secured themselves to make sure that they're effective and they're not being exposed either. So we'll see how these things go as we move forward. So next slide, please. So the first thing I want to talk about is that for point of sale, the pay wallets, again, Apple, Google, and Samsung, they do leverage some common security methods here. And so, first, I'm going to show the items on this slide that are features of all the payment wallets that deploy. So first of all, they all deploy EMVCo payment tokenization to protect the payment account number. And so EMVCo payment tokenization, as most of you know, it means that the payment token is replacing the real account number or the real payment credentials during the transaction that you're making over the phone, either online or through point of sale. And that payment token is not mathematically related back to the PAN, so you can't easily change it into a PAN. But at the same time, the token follows the same format as a real PAN, so for processing the transaction, at least it's easier to go through the flow the same way the real PAN would process. Also, PANs are never shared or stored with the wallet provider or in the mobile phone when you're using one of these pay wallets. Secondly, all the work with the issuers and the merchants to make sure that the customer is the owner of the card before it's provisioned is done through a process of what we're calling identity and verification, or ID&V. And this is performed during the enrollment before the issuer provisions a token to the wallet. Another area they have in common is in doing user authentication. They all enable the consumers to authenticate with some form of biometrics, such as a fingerprint or maybe facial recognition or a passcode, but that's pretty standard between the pay wallets as well. And finally, near-field communication as a protocol is something that they all use between the mobile device, communicating between the mobile device and the merchant point-of-sale terminal or reader for point-of-sale transactions. So as a baseline, these things are common between all of them, and they're all providing some level of security to the process. Next slide, please. So here I just want to talk a little bit more about an overview of the payment tokenization process. Again, they're very high level, because tokenization is not a new concept, but the shift to mobile technology and the sophistication of the related payments fraud that we're seeing has really heightened the need to take that payment card credential out of the clear, as we all hear people saying, and away from the transaction. So tokenization of the card data, starting with the enrollment and then going all the way through the transaction with a couple of exceptions, which I'll talk about later, is one way to do that. And then coupled with other kinds of security methods such as encryption and storing authentication, you're really strengthening the security of these mobile transactions. And EMVCo developed a spec to remove the PAN from the mobile transaction and prevent it from being stolen or cloned. So in part one of this wallet webinar series a couple of weeks ago, it covered the flow of the mobile wallet transaction and showed some of the new parties that are involved in the tokenization process, in addition to the issuer, acquirer, merchant, and card network. And they're what I'm showing here, the token service provider, the token requester. And so they each have different responsibilities that I just want to go over briefly. But first of all, the token service provider is the one that generates and provisions the payment tokens that are going to be provisioned to the customer wallet. It manages the secure centralized token vault where the tokens and the actual PANs that they get mapped to are stored on behalf of the issuer. And then it also is responsible for detokenizing, which means mapping the token back to the original PAN when in a couple of key places in the transaction flow, the actual PAN is needed for authorization with the issuer rather than the token. And then the TSP also manages the token lifecycle. The token requester is the one that wants the tokens, and so that's an authorized entity that has to be registered with EMVCo, and that entity is going to request and maintain the tokens from the token service provider. And examples here would be a mobile wallet provider, like one of the pay wallets, or a merchant, or even a card-on-file system. But they have to go through a process to be certified and approved through the overall owner of this, or EMVCo. So one thing, you may say, well, there are a lot of, everybody can be a token requester, and what would happen if we have lots of these out there in terms of security and managing this? Well, it's a very high bar to become a token service provider through EMVCo in the United States, and I am focused on the U.S. I understand there are some differences in other countries, but it's a high bar here. And so in today's environment, primarily the payment networks are the TSPs, and that they were the first ones. However, they are starting to work with other organizations to become third-party TSPs. And for example, I've noted three here, the Clearinghouse, First Data, and PayPal. So just looking at those organizations and the size and the breadth of their responsibilities, you'll see that it's not just anybody who can be a token service provider, given the level of responsibility and liability and security needed for managing all of these payment account numbers and tokens. And any new token service provider also has to be registered by EMVCo, but then also approved and certified by the individual payment networks that they're going to work with. So next slide, please. So here we want to talk about how EMV and the payment tokenization process secure the credentials. And there are multiple factors that work with the token to secure the credentials. First, there are things called domain restrictions. And domain restrictions basically limit the use of the payment token either to a certain channel, so maybe it can only be used, that token can only be used online or only at the point of sale, or limited to a specific merchant. They can set dollar limits for the purchases. Maybe it's also limited that it can only be used in certain countries, and even by type of purchase. So these domain restrictions are set working, by the token requester working with the TSP when the payment token is created, and then they're stored in the token vault. And next, as you'll see in a later slide, tokens are only converted back to the original PAN in the steps between the token service provider and the issuer for authorization. So the token demapping, which is, making it into the real PAN, really it requires keys that access the lookup table in the token vault that can match the token to the original value. So again, that's all very securely contained in the token vault for that process. And then the other critical component for tokenization here is that EMV code tokens are enhanced for security with a cryptogram. Think of it as an algorithm or as a key that's generated to support dynamic authentication for each transaction. It's unique to every payment transaction, and that's whether it's an NFC mobile transaction or even in an EMV card. And if it's mobile, the cryptogram is generated in the phone or in the cloud, depending on the pay wallet. And again, it's only valid for one, that cryptogram is only valid for one transaction. The purpose of that cryptogram is to authenticate the transaction when it's validated by the token service provider function or the issuer, depending on the key structure used to generate the cryptogram, and again, using keys associated with the issuer. But the key thing here is that by removing the PAN from the transaction data, consumers and merchants are going to have a more secure mobile payment process and hopefully reducing the risk of potential compromise by not passing or exposing the PAN and the clear during the more vulnerable spots in the transaction flow. Next slide, please. So just talking first about how we're securing the credentials during the enrollment of a customer in one of the pay wallets. What I want to do here is just talk about provisioning, which is very important to establishing a secure wallet relationship, and just use the Apple wallet as an example here. Could be slightly different for a Samsung and Google, but generally speaking, the user is going to enroll their payment card into the mobile phone by loading the card data into the device. And then if it's Apple, the mobile phone will send the card data to the Apple server, and it's going over a secure network. So again, there's security right away in terms of transmitting this data. Apple's going to encrypt the data with the payment network key and send it to the issuing bank, and that's where the identity and verification, or the ID&V process, is going to take place. The issuer is going to use that information to authenticate the cardholder identity, by looking at different data that's been provided about the user, about that they know about the user, with the goal of trying to establish confidence in the binding or the connecting of the payment token to the person. Is this the real person? Is this really their account before I assign this token to them and allow it to go into their wallet? And so some of the ID&V methods that are included are account verification message, a risk score based on their assessment of the PAN, a one-time password using a billing address, device ID and location, and there's probably lots of other stuff they don't even talk about, but there are many ways to try to help do this process. So the issuer may approve the request without needing much more customer authentication, but if they are concerned that it's a high risk or they're suspicious, they'll do something called step-up authentication for further verification. And that could be an out-of-band authentication, so sending a one-time password to the customer's phone that they have to respond to, or even directing the customer to the call center to guarantee the customer is good standing. And even there, the call center also has to have good controls in place, that they're asking the right questions and they're making sure they're not helping the consumer answer the questions, as things we saw a long time ago. But it's just another level that they determine if they need that or not. So once it's approved, assuming it is approved, the pay wallet would contact the token service provider and request permission from the issuer to enable the pay wallet. And so the issuer at that point will transmit the real payment account number to the token service provider, where it will generate a token and then get that provisioned on behalf of the financial institution to the actual wallet. At the same time, the token service provider is assigning a value to what they call the token assurance value after the issuer completes the ID&V process. And this is so that there's some level of confidence that the merchant can see in terms of, how strong they think or how confident they can be that this token to PAN cardholder binding is good. And I guess it can go from 0 to 99, and I'm not sure what the average number is. I would hope it's close to the top there, but it is another measurement or a sense of confidence that they set based on doing all this ID&V. This is a point also where the token service provider and the token requester will establish the domain restriction controls, and then the token service provider will then send the token to the token requester, who will then provision it to the mobile wallet. So again, there are probably slight variations of this with the different pay wallets, but that's the general flow of this process. Next slide, please. So the next slide shows the payment process for a pay wallet tokenized transaction at point of sale. If you were on the earlier webinar a couple of weeks ago, you saw this slide. So I really don't want to go through it in any detail because you'll have already had that. But what I really want to point out here is that if you look at it, you see the places where you see the little lock where it says payment token and the gold, and you see the orange that says PAN, to show you through the flow where you only are getting the token and the cryptogram, and where in this process you're seeing the need to detokenize it and actually have the real PAN used for the authentication process. So the person is tapping their phone at point of sale and initiating the transaction. The message at that point is sending the payment token from the mobile device with the cryptogram that was generated in the phone to the merchant or the merchant acquirer, and then they were going to send that to the payment network. So up to that point, that's all. There's not one place where the PAN is exposed there. It's just the token and the cryptogram. When the payment network gets it, they have to request through the TSP to first validate that it's a unique cryptogram, because, again, it's only one per transaction. So if a fraudster got it and tried to reuse it, this is where the TSP would say, you can't, this isn't a valid transaction because this cryptogram has been used before or something. It's not unique. So once they verify it, the TSP is going to detokenize that token and actually send the real PAN back to the payment network, who can send it onto the issuer processor and then to the actual issuing bank so that they can do the authorization and complete that step. So the issuer is going to review it, send the response back, again with the real PAN, to the processor and the network. And then at that point, again, it's only still in that kind of circle on the right there, the payment network is going to send it back to the merchant acquirer processor with the token, not the PAN. So it stops right there where it began, and all the way back through the flow back to the merchant acquirer and the merchant, there is nowhere that that PAN is exposed. And this is what's critical to this whole tokenization process, that we're not having that number in the clear other than at points where communicating between the network, the token service provider, or the issuer, it's going over secure lines in order, which they do today, in order to authorize it and verify information. So this is what's critical about this process. And while there are some variations of the flow, whether it's in-app or in the digital world, the back end where you're doing the detokenizing and validation with the issuer, it's still the only place where the PAN is exposed. So next slide, please. So here I want to talk about the way the different payment wallets are storing the information. So this slide shows some of the technical differences between the pay wallets and how each one of them handles storage and retrieval of payment tokens for using NFC with the communication protocol. So first of all, you've got NFC pay wallets. One of the differences is they reside on different mobile operating systems, or they use different ones, iOS for Apple or the Android operating system. And then each of them stores and retrieves their payment tokens differently. With Apple, and I will go into these a little bit more detail, but Apple is based on using a secure element. Google is using host card emulation, and Samsung Pay is using host card emulation, but also a trusted execution environment for the storage part. And then they all have other controls unrelated to NFC, but just other controls within the mobile environment to prevent downloading the wallet to a rooted or a jailbroken phone. They have the ability to disable the app or shut down the device to block that or block malware, or prevent the device tampering. So there are other securities around that, but the key areas that I want to cover are how they're storing and retrieving the tokens in a secure way. So next slide, please. So as I said, Apple Pay stores the payment token in the secure element, which is a tamper-resistant chip embedded into the mobile device when it's manufactured, so it's not removable. And it securely hosts the applications and cryptographic data, such as the wallet app, the payment credentials, or static tokens, cryptographic keys within it. So it's storing the sensitive data via encryption keys, which is how it's protecting it. And secure elements have been around a long time, long before mobile payments, mobile phones existed, used in other use cases not related to payments. So it's a recognized security. There's an established certification process. It's considered highly secure when it's used. Before I go into the others, though, I wanted to mention the NFC controller, which is used by all of the three payment wallets. This is what's managing the traffic and the radio frequency signals between the mobile phone and the point-of-sale terminal or reader to pass a token. And it contains a built-in antenna that communicates between the mobile phone and the point-of-sale terminal, so that you need that piece as well if you're using NFC. For Apple Pay specifically, though, the secure element, not only does it perform card emulation for Apple Pay, it also is storing the token. So it's doing both of those things. And the token is stored in the mobile Apple wallet until it's needed to make a transaction. So then when the customer taps at the point-of-sale reader, it's signaling the mobile secure element to send the token to the point of sale. And at that time, the token will get moved to the secure element where the cryptogram will be generated, and then both are sent to the point of sale terminal to process the transaction. And Apple's unique also because they own all their own devices, and they're able to control access to the secure element because of that, which is one reason why it's harder for the other two pay wallets to try to use a secure element rather than something else like host card emulation. So next slide, please. So as I was just saying, so Google Pay uses host card emulation with NFC, and Android operating system phones, whether they're Google or Samsung, they can't use the secure element because they have multiple phone manufacturers, they're a different mobile operating system, and they can't really control everything that's stored and done in the secure element in any phone because they're different. So Google Pay uses host card emulation software in lieu of the secure element to emulate the NFC card and then stores the payment credentials and tokens in a different way. There's a master key that represents the PAN, and it's stored in the cloud or the Google server. And that master key is generating the dynamic token keys. They can be limited or one-time use. Again, I think that varies by wallet. And so when that happens, a small number of those dynamic token keys are downloaded and stored in a secure area of the mobile phone operating system. And that happens each time the user connects to the network. By storing a few of these dynamic keys on the mobile device, one, if you're only storing a few, it limits your risk, and it also enables the transactions to occur if you don't have any network connectivity. And then when you connect again, you get more tokens. But this is very different than the way Apple does it. So when a customer is ready to pay, the host card emulation enables the NFC controller, which is coordinating between the point-of-sale terminal and the mobile wallet, to get one of those dynamic tokens out of the phone for the transaction. And that's when the token there, too, will generate the cryptogram and will be passed with the token to the point-of-sale terminal, and the process follows along the same way after that. So also for secure reasons, dynamic token keys are restricted, and they usually expire quickly so that they have minimal value to fraudsters, even if for some reason they were able to get at them. But since the wallet for Google Pay resides in the mobile operating system, it is considered somewhat less secure than a secure element. So in order to make it more secure, it just requires additional software-based security, something like white box cryptography, which is going to hide the key or prevent it within the host card emulation application so that it would be hard for a fraudster to find it and be able to reverse engineer it and use it. So they add other layers of security to compensate for not being able to use the secure element. Next slide, please. So Samsung Pay is even a little bit different further along here. And as I said, this isn't intended to be really technical, because even for me, this is more understand it from a business perspective, but there's some components I think that might be a little bit technical. But Samsung Pay uses host card emulation as well to communicate with NFC, but they store the tokens in the trusted execution environment, which is in the phone. It's considered a secure area of the main processor within the mobile phone, and it contains something called trusted applications that manage user authentication, the data encryption keys, and key management, and it communicates with the payment networks. So this trusted execution environment segregates these trusted applications from any other non-secure type operations or other user-installed apps that might be running in the operating system in the phone. And it does that by using some kind of combination of hardware and software with cryptography to isolate that TEE environment and ensure the security of the storage and the data. In the Samsung Pay situation, it stores static payment tokens and the associated keys that they use to generate the dynamic cryptogram for each of the transactions. So it's considered more secure probably than just the basic mobile operating system, because it's in an isolated secure area, but still considered a little less secure than a secure element because it doesn't have that tamper-resistant chip there. Now, I mentioned just briefly here the Samsung Pay MST, or Magnetic Secure Transmission, which is what they use for phones that don't have NFC enabled in them, and it's using underlying technology that's like swiping your magnetic stripe card. So it's basically just a different way of communicating or transmitting the token from your phone to the terminal, so you can pay with your phone even if you don't have NFC. But that's just sort of, I'm just throwing that in because people ask about it as mentioned, but it's not an NFC type of transaction. However, it does have the same tokenization behind the scenes based on when the card number is provisioned to the phone. Next slide, please. So moving to the digital channel, we're seeing obviously that using wallets in the CardNotPresent channel has created some new risks. We know that the volume just in general of CardNotPresent payments initiated from a mobile phone, whether it's your app or your mobile browser, is growing, has been growing for the past few years, is expected to continue growing at a rapid pace. And just for one stat here, the Fed study that was published last year showed that the EMV chip migration shifted fraud from card present to card not present transactions. Again, we knew that, but that it represented 61% of the U.S. card fraud value in 2016, up from 48% in 2015. Now, I know we're already into 2019. We'll hopefully get more information when they do their next study, and I would expect it's going to be up even higher at that point. But just to show you the increase in the percentage in terms of card fraud, it is a big number and it's big dollars. So card not present payments are riskier because the mobile device and the owner aren't physically present, particularly if it's a browser transaction. And browsers may not be as secure if a customer has to enter his or her payment credentials in the clear each time they're making a payment or buying something. And even if they're not and they're stored on file or the card on file model, it's still at risk of being breached if they're not, if they've got the PAN stored in there and they're not tokenizing them in the card on file systems. And then because it's a card not present transaction, once a fraudster gets a PAN, they can quickly use it to make other purchases even before a customer knows about it. So these, there are a lot of different risks in this area that need attention. And we need enhanced tools to authenticate the user and to protect the sensitive payment data. And here again, there are tools out there, but the card not present security tools, they vary in sophistication, they vary in coverage in terms of what they cover, what they focus on, and I think there needs to be more work done there as well. So next slide, please. So looking at the flow for the in-app transactions, in addition to securing payment credentials at the point of sale, tokenization is also becoming more important as a strong security tool to address the increasing mobile e-commerce volume and the shift in fraud. But for card not present transactions using tokenization, it's a slightly different process than making purchases using NFC at point of sale. to generate and pass the token and the cryptogram. So you're not tapping, so there's no way to just say, okay, tap and let's signal it, and I'm going to send the token and the cryptogram over to the merchant terminal. You don't have that option. So instead, the mobile wallet app, so whether it's Google, Apple, or Samsung Pay, is going to interact with an API to initiate the payment with the card network of the token that I selected, the card that's in my wallet, and then the consumer will verify the amount. And then once they do that, it's the mobile wallet that's going to authenticate the user using your biometric fingerprint or your PIN. And then here, they're going to return an encrypted payment token with the cryptogram to the mobile app, which is then sent to the merchant acquirer, and then they route it to the payment network, which is similar to what we saw in the point of sale flow. And then again, it's going to get to the token service provider to verify the cryptogram. And here again, they're going to detokenize it so that they can send the real or the clear payment account number to the payment network and to the issuer in order to do the authorization and approve this for payment. So, it's going back through the same process. But the key here again is that still at that same section where you see the big kind of square up there with the card networks in it, the token service provider linking to the payment network and the issuer on the right, that's the only place where that real account number is, I don't even want to say exposed because it's protected, but there's no token. Everywhere else, again, through the in-app transaction flow, you're seeing a token rather than a payment account number for security. And then similarly, in the next slide, if we look at the flow for the payment network cloud-based digital checkout wallets. So here we're talking about MasterCard MasterPass, Amex Express Checkout, Discover, and I want to make one note that Visa is not noted here because I guess it's not considered a real, it's not a cloud-based wallet, and so it's not depicted, but they've got a similar solution. These digital checkout wallets are used to pay for secure online and card-not-present purchases from mobile apps or from the browser in order to help to decrease fraud and card abandonment. So it's another wallet type here. And in this case, with these wallets, or these checkout wallets as we call them, the online merchants would sign up to accept the wallet, and then consumers can enroll their card information. And they might be enrolled automatically through their online banking system, or they can enroll through the wallet, the digital checkout wallet itself. But they need to be enrolled and registered to participate. And then from a security perspective, the card network is here going to store the payment and shipping information. So that means the merchants themselves don't have to store these payment account numbers. And so they're not going to be exposed if there's any kind of a breach. So the payment token here is generated, but as I said, the process to get the token is different than for the point-of-sale wallets with NFC. Once the cardholder logs in with they have to have a username and password, or it could be a phone number and their password to their wallet, they're going to be here, they're going to be redirected to the cloud wallet server to authenticate. And then when they're ready to pay, the cardholder will verify the amount and select the token and get redirected back to the mobile app or to the web. And this is where there's something new here. When they're redirected back there, a payment transaction ID has been generated. It's a unique number that's tied to that specific customer transaction that they've just purchased, but it's not the token or the cryptogram. It's separate. It's basically passing back to the merchant so that the merchant can use that payment transaction ID in order to request the token and the cryptogram. And once they get the token and the cryptogram, the rest of the flow going to the payment network and the token service provider and the issuer is the same as everything else. But because we're dealing with the online, mobile or digital payments here, they need another way to actually request the token, and so that's why this payment transaction ID was developed for the process. So probably a little too much detail there, but the point is that these digital wallets are another way of being able to do secure purchases online through your mobile phone and not exposing the card numbers. Okay, next slide, please. And so the other cloud-based digital wallets that I just want to mention can be either large payment service providers or even large merchants. But one of the things that they've been doing for a while is having to address account takeover fraud. And we know that's one of the largest growing attacks, becoming an increasingly prevalent type of online threat and really impacting e-commerce wallets in general. So account takeover occurs at account creation, where card-not-present accounts are most vulnerable. And it happens when the user enrolls their payment credentials, and then they log in with their username and password, which obviously, it's very commonly stolen. And so if the fraudsters get that information, they can get the bank account number, the credit card number, debit card number, other personal information, email, password, username, and even social security number in some cases. But once they get that information, it allows them to take control of an existing account or even establish a new account, and then use that account to create unauthorized fraudulent payment transactions. And depending on how quick it takes you to figure it out that it happened to you, they can do a lot of damage. So the larger merchants and the payment service providers, and I'm just using PayPal and Amazon as examples here, they've been doing this stuff for a long time, and they've got very sophisticated, and in most cases proprietary risk engines and modeling tools to mitigate fraud related to account takeover, which is why they have very, very low fraud rates. So they've performed behavioral analytics and transaction monitoring. They look at behavior patterns, spending patterns and trends. They look at a lot of other customer profile data that they've had as as the customers use it, they build on it. And then they've developed risk scores so that they can quickly accept or decline transactions and know right away whether or not they're good or bad. They use iterative processes, so they're continuously monitoring and adding to data and updating their rules and files with information in order to keep on top of all this. So, that's what the big guys do. But some of the merchants who maybe don't have that opportunity, or it's not something that they can manage on their own, they're looking now at possibly tokenizing their own card-on-file systems, their payment credentials. So just, if there's a big merchant out there that you purchase through online and you've given them your card number once and you notice you don't have to retype it every time you go in if you've got an account username and password. Well, they're most likely, in many cases, storing that live payment account number in their file, which means if they get breached, the fraudsters are going to get your real numbers. So what's recently happening is that working with the card networks, they're starting to look at possibly tokenizing all these card numbers that are in the card-on-file systems, but doing it through the networks. And that way, once those card numbers are tokenized, even when the customer goes in to make a purchase, the card numbers are no longer in that file. There's a token developed similarly to what we were just talking about that is there instead, and that's going to protect them. And it's going to protect the merchants because they're no longer storing these card numbers. So I think this is relatively new. The only one that we've heard about that has been either starting to do it or looking at doing it is Netflix, but this is something that potentially other online merchants could consider doing down the road as this evolves in order to really protect the data in the file. And you're no longer storing the card numbers on file, you're storing tokens on file. Next slide, please. So another security feature related to card-not-present security that I want to talk about is risk-based authentication. Everyone, I'm sure, has heard a lot about the EMVCo 3D Secure Protocol for card-not-present authentication, which enables consumers to authenticate themselves with their card issuer when making card-not-present transactions. And when the merchants implement it, the liability for fraud or fraudulent transactions shifts to the issuer. So this protects the merchant from exposure to fraud-related chargebacks. It improves online transaction security, and it really, if it works well, it's going to encourage growth in e-commerce payments. But the first version of 3D Secure, version 1.0, which was developed several years ago by the card networks, was done even before mobile payments existed, and it really only worked for PC browser and e-commerce transactions. It didn't work for mobile payments. And version 1 was not really popular around here, I guess. It required enrollment of all customers if the merchant had signed up. It was knowledge-based, meaning that, we would ask for secret questions or information that nobody ever remembered the answers to. And it also required interaction with the customer for every transaction they made if 3DS was being used, not only in addition to remembering what the answers to the questions might be. So, not surprisingly, this caused high customer abandonment, a lot of friction, merchant frustration, and as a result, low U.S. adoption of 3DS version 1. So EMVCo developed, working with the networks, a version 2, which is a secure messaging authentication protocol that enables risk-based real-time cardholder authentication directly from the card issuer during online transactions. And it's expected to start rolling out, I think, into production sometime this year, is my understanding. So next slide, please. So just a little bit more about some of the differences and the benefits of version 2 of 3DS. It's much more customer and merchant friendly. And the one big thing, it's, as I said, it's a risk-based decision process. So it only authenticates when the risk exceeds a predetermined level. And the merchants and issuers basically exchange more data than they could in the old version. They can exchange a lot more data to determine the risk back and forth. So the device ID, geolocation, the phone number, email address, lots of other things that they themselves can determine. And then using that information, the issuer is going to determine the need for additional authentication on higher risk transactions, sort of like I talked about before with the identity and verification, and maybe a stepped up level of authentication to see if they need to verify a customer they might consider high risk. But they only will do that. The average, from what we've heard, is that it only impacts about 5% of customer transactions where you need to be transparent to them. And even there, if the merchant decides, well, I really know this customer based on information I have or my experience with the customer, I don't even think you need to go to that higher level or stepped up authentication for a customer. The merchant can say they can opt out of that. So it's definitely very low friction in terms of any customer impacts. Participating customers are automatically enrolled. It's expanded so it does support multiple channels. It supports the mobile browser, mobile app, as well as the PC browser. And it really doesn't have to take the customer away or interrupt the customer from the merchant's checkout page to do the issuer verification unless they have to do that stepped up process where, again, they might have to say, I'm going to send you a one-time password or something else in order to verify that extra level. And again, this would occur at a very low percentage of the customers. So much less disruptive. And this picture on the right, the only point that it's in there is just showing that these 3 domains, the 3 domain secure, one area is where the customer transaction is authenticated in the issuer domain. The 3DS transaction is initiated in the middle in the interoperability domain. And then that third column where it says acquirer, it's where the transactions for 3DS are switched between the issuer and the acquirer. And again, this is much more interactive where they're passing data and information back and forth with each other in order to get the best information they can to make the decision without bothering the customer, and also doing it very quickly and efficiently with better information. So, this is expected to be, I think, a very positive tool as we go forward in the CardNotPresent world. And as organizations and merchants and others start to roll it out this year, we'll all be looking closely to see how well this is working. Next slide, please. So the last one that I want to talk about is QR quick response codes, as we all are familiar with those in general. They're also used in some of the wallets as well, not near-field communication, but they also store, they use a QR code rather than putting the PIN exposed when they're making a transaction and it's not stored on the phone. They also can use passcodes and fingerprints to lock them and prevent fraudulent access to the device or the phone. And anything they're doing like that is going to help with PCI requirements because they're still protecting the card number. So a couple of examples. I'm going to jump down because I realize just what time it is, but EMVCo introduced specs last year, I think, to try to standardize the consistency of QR codes that are generated or captured on the mobile phone for consumers. And there are 2 models. One is the merchant-presented QR code model, and this is where the consumers use their mobile app to scan a merchant-presented QR code and initiate a payment transaction. And this one, it might be an example of what the Walmart model might be. The other model here for EMVCo is the consumer-presented QR code, and this one I equate to Dunkin' Donuts because that's where I use this. Consumers would select a QR option for payment in their mobile app and then display the code, and then the merchant would scan it with their scanner to pay for a purchase. And so these are also, they have, different kinds of security than the NFC wallets, but obviously with the passcode protection, they're not using the real payment account number when you're paying, you're using a QR code. And so you've got some level of security there. And we're seeing, a lot of different merchants and others using these as an alternative to NFC. So next slide, please. Just in summary here, there are lots of layers of security. It's not one size fits all. There's no one method that's going to protect everything. But there are a lot of good options that work in certain situations that I think everyone needs to be familiar with, and then make the best decisions on what they're using to protect their own either wallets or their own data as they go through this mobile and digital wallet process. Next slide, please. And just in summary, we know that mobile wallets leverage security provided by the mobile device and the components in the mobile operating system and the mobile app. And if it's used appropriately, both the physical and logical components can be protected and mobile wallets can effectively be secure. But broad use of effective and multi-layered security approaches for all wallet models is still lacking. So it's being used, but the key is the broad use of it effectively across the board. We still in the industry have work to do to improve that. And one way is through increased awareness and education across stakeholders, excuse me, as well as working groups like we have with the U.S. Payments Forum and others to really figure out how to bring all this together so that we can expand the use of the security that's available for mobile and digital wallets. And so with that, I'm going to turn to the next slide. And we're going to, as you see, we're asking the same question again. Now that you've heard these presentation slides, what do you think? Have you changed your mind, or you still see that they're secure, more secure, or less secure than the chip cards? And we'll see if that changed at all. I'm not sure if we are seeing any differences yet here. We want to go to there we go. Actually, it looks about the same as the beginning and the end. So you had your opinions all set before we heard the presentation, but generally it's over half. It looks like, I can't quite see. It looks about 60-some-odd% that are saying it's more secure than chip cards, and about 30-something as secure, and somewhere between 10 and 20% it's cut off that are saying less secure, but I would say it's closer to 10%. So that's good, because I think there's a lot of good opportunity and tools and approaches out there that can make sure we have secure mobile payments. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Randy. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, and your voice actually made it almost to the very end. That was a really terrific session, and I realize that we are at the top of the hour, and some of you may have to leave us, but we're going to stay with you for another 5 or 10 minutes or so to take some of your questions if you have the opportunity to stay with us. So before we actually get into the Q&A, if we just go to the next slide, I wanted to mention, as I said in my opening remarks, that we have prepared an online assessment quiz for each of the webinars, and each quiz is multiple choice, and there's less than 10 questions per quiz. So if you want to participate in this, here's the link at the bottom where the assessment will be held, but you'll also get this link in the email that will follow up today's sessions. So if we go to the next slide, I also wanted to point out 2 additional resources for people who are interested in discussions on mobile wallets and digital payments. The first is that if we can go to the next slide, please. The first resource is the U.S. Payments Forum member meeting and the Payment Summit, which is being held in Phoenix, Arizona, March 11th through the 14th. And information is available on the U.S. Payments Forum website about registration and the agenda, and I suggest you take a look at that. Also, there's an additional white paper that's available for free online about considerations for mobile wallets for merchants and finance institutions. And you could read that white paper and share that with your colleagues as well. Now, if we could go to the last slide there, we'll just leave this up for our contact information, and we'll take a couple of questions here from the audience. Let's see, the first question to you, Marianne, is I've heard about Fitbit Pay, and where do you see this fitting in the context of the wallets landscapes that you had in one of your earlier slides?
Well, I think that depends on if it's like the pay wallets and like the watches and things like that, then I think it would fit in with that category. If there's tokenization involved, I think the same kind of process would work for that type of a device, similar to the watches.
Right. So the Fitbit would be provisioned from the issuer. So the Fitbit is actually the token requester in this case, and the customer would store a tokenized version of their payment credential on the device that would then be used to complete a payment transaction and following the same tokenized rules as before. Next question is, it has to do with CardNotPresent transactions. What can consumers do to protect themselves from fraud with CardNotPresent transactions? I think this question relates to your last slide about the 3DS and other technologies to protect against fraud, but maybe you can talk a little bit about, how the consumers would benefit from that technology.
Sure. I think as a consumer, one of the first things that I do when I go on a website is to look at what my options are for paying. And to be honest, if I have to put my account number in there and just key it in once, I'll look for other options. So does the website or the merchant offer one of the checkout choices, whether it's MasterPass or one of the others, is something like a PayPal button or something that is a known reputable provider in the middle there, or one of the pay wallet options, obviously. But I think it's important for them to know where they're buying things from and where they're actually putting their account information. So if they're keying it in and it's being stored on file, what kind of a company is it? Do we know if they're doing any tokenization in the background? I think it's important for consumers to do some of their own research and also take advantage of what the banks and the issuers are providing through some of these tools for them if they're available.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne. I also would add to that answer that if you're using a mobile phone and a mobile wallet to buy online, that has the added security of the transaction being fully tokenized, and so your payment credential isn't exposed, as opposed to if you're working from a desktop or a tablet that you are keying in your payment information. So in a way, CardNotPresent transactions have a different definition when used on a mobile device from a security perspective. Okay, I think we can take one more question here. Let's see, we got a bunch of them. I'm trying to find the one that is relevant here. So since this webinar is about security, you talked about the secure element as a part of the hardware security in a mobile device. Marianne, can you explain, or I can help with this, why a secure element is secure? Like what makes the secure element the most secure way to store that payment credential on the phone?
Well, Randy, I'll give my little version and you can certainly elaborate. I mean, my understanding, because of one, that it's actually a physical chip in the card, that you can't get out the information that's in there, that's a level of protection that the software or the other models don't have. And it's something that's been around for years and years, and the way it's manufactured and the way it's shipped from one place to another is with the keys involved in it to protect the information is highly secure. But that's a level of my ability to answer that, so feel free to add to that.
No, actually, you answered that very well, Marianne. The hardware security is always going to be a step more secure than software security or cloud-based security, because the manufacturers of those chips have built-in defenses to prevent someone from being able to penetrate without proper access the secure information that's stored in the chip. And for criminals, it would only be able to steal information from one card, from one account holder, and it really is going to be a much bigger effort to try to crack the security of the secure element to access that one credential than it would be to find other ways to commit fraud or steal payment credentials. So that's why it has been kind of the gold standard in mobile. Okay, I think we will end there. I want to again thank you all for your participation today, and for those of you who were able to stay on a little longer with us. Special thanks to Marianne, our presenter, for done a terrific job in articulating all of the aspects of security in mobile and mobile payments. And if anyone wants to follow up with any questions that weren't answered in today's webinar, they can send an email to us and we'll try to respond to those questions. And a reminder that today's webinar has been recorded and will be available for playback along with the presentation deck after the webinar has concluded. You will receive an email with the link to where you can listen to the recording and download the presentation. And please feel free to share this information within your organization to others who could not participate in today's webinar. So this concludes today's webinar. Thank you and have a great day.